All right, friends, welcome to a special Q&A on one of the leading and most influential theologians, arguably of the past 15 years, the name of Michael Heiser. But we have two specialists here to weigh in and answer questions. Number one, who is streaming in from North Carolina, Joel Muddamalle. We talked about his book, The Unseen Battle, and just did an interview on that. It's getting a lot of good traction online. We have dozens of questions there. We also have one of my colleagues and one of the leading experts on Colossians. He literally has written a commentary on Colossians, world expert on Ephesians and spiritual warfare, the one and only Clint Arnold, to weigh in as well. Clint, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's always great to be with you, Sean.
Well, we got more questions than we literally have time for, so let's jump into a few that people emailed into. And these were sent to questions@seanmcdowell.org. A few of these are on YouTube, and then we'll take some live ones that people have here. And I think a number of people roughly asked this question. And some people said, how does the fall of Lucifer fit into the timeline of watchers, councils, and sons of God? Where was he? And was his fall, along with 1/3 of the angels, related in any way to these particular events involving sons of God, councils, and watchers? Satan seems absent in the story, yet he's the primary figure of evil in the New Testament. Joel, maybe remind us just briefly of what you're arguing for in the unseen battle for those who are getting caught up, and then explain how Satan fits into this.
Yeah, so in the unseen battle, one of the things I'm arguing for is that God is a king. He's the cosmic king of heaven and earth. I think our definitions are really, really important. So I don't want people to misunderstand me. Yahweh is the uncreated creator, which means that all things come from him. He's the first cause. And he chooses to have a divine family and a human family. And we get this from the terms like Bene Elohim, sons of God. And so that kind of sets in play the concept of the divine council, which was well understood by kind of the ancient Near Eastern perspective. This concept was around in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, the Mesopotamian context, and it's present in the biblical text. One of the most prolific and important passages might be Psalm 82, which places God in the midst of a divine council. We find this in the opening pages of Job chapter 1, chapter 2, and then Job 38. And so that's kind of the framework, is that God is king. He's got a council. Some people might ask, why would he need a council? To which I'd probably respond, why does he need humanity, or why did he choose to create humanity? It's because he's a king and he gets to choose how he wants to interact in and through creation. There's a certain level of sovereignty that goes with that. So that hopefully, Sean, sets the scene for the divine council.
Perfect. I love that. Now, before we come to Satan, anything you would want to add, Clint, in terms of what Heiser's worldview is and what we mean by kind of the divine council?
Yeah, I want to begin by just congratulating Joel on your new book, and I look forward to getting into it in much more detail. In the weeks ahead, I'll be teaching a class on spiritual warfare in the fall here at Biola University. So look forward to plowing into it in depth in that way. But congratulations on that. And I was 10 years here in academic administration, and it was the 10 most productive years of Michael Heiser. And so when I stepped down from being the dean of the seminary in 2022 and was going to teach spiritual warfare again as one of the courses here, I thought, I'd been asked so many times about Michael Heiser. What do you think about Michael Heiser? This, that, and so on. And I didn't know. And so over the last couple of years, I've read a lot more, and I have found what he has said about divine counsel to be very helpful. It's been very helpful for better understanding Genesis 6, Psalm 82, Job 1 and 2, as you've mentioned, Joel. And so I think there's a lot of merit in what is being said there.
Love it. Good, helpful. So let's go to one of the questions that was most commonly asked, which is how Satan fits into this. And there's a couple ways to come at this, referencing Ezekiel 28, or just asking as a whole, Joel, how does he fit into this whole Heiser approach where we're talking about the watchers, the councils, and the sons of God? How does Satan fit into this narrative?
Yeah, one of the things that's a little hard, I mean, I would I would just lament the fact that Mike's not here to answer all of these questions himself. And so I'm going to do my very best to represent him. I studied underneath him. He was my second reader in my doctoral program, my PhD program. And I'm going to pull a little bit from just my personal interactions with Mike. Mike was so orthodox. Like, he was incredibly evangelical. He very much understood Satan in a lot of the same terms that we would understand. I would just say that Mike was also a committed Hebrew Bible scholar, and he would want us to try to not force our narrative structure and understanding that at times gets systematized of Satan into biblical passages and understand it on its own terms. And so Mike and I disagreed actually on different things.
Okay.
I tend to be a little bit more of a biblical theology guy. And so, the question of the identity of the Hasatan, we got into this in our interview, Sean. I'm okay reading Satan into that, recognizing that the Hebrew grammar with the article in front of it is really not talking about a person, but a title and a function. So, but again, that's a fun debate. Okay, this question, I think the place I'd want to start is where the Bible starts, and that is with the Nakash, this serpent. And it seems to be, and I'm very curious what Clinton is going to say about this, but when you get into Genesis 1 verse 2, you've got this Hebrew phrase, tohu vabohu, which can be wasteland and wilderness. It seems to be there is this chaotic element to the world, and God steps in and he creates order from the disorder. And then you have the serpent who comes in to deceive Adam and Eve. And I'm going to draw on G.K. Beale's work of The Temple and the Mission of God, where Adam and Eve I don't think we should see them as gardeners, like they're glorified gardeners in Eden trying to just purely cultivate the soil. They should be seen as prophet, priest, and king. They should be seen as the Hebrew word shamar, to protect, which calls into question, why would God give them a task to protect? The same Hebrew word used of the watchman on the tower in Nehemiah, same word that's used of the Levitical priesthood that's used to kind of guard the holiness of the temple. Like, why that? And why don't Eve and Adam freak out when a serpent starts to talk? Like, all of these kind of questions are rolling together. And so I would say the origin story of the serpent, we find a glimpse of it right off the bat in Genesis chapter 3. And we see that there is an ongoing rebellion that is taking place. There's an ongoing impression that this figure is working behind the scenes and sometimes are right out in the open to create chaos. And then I would look at like Ezekiel 28:15, where I just want to say what the text says clearly. We can say, here's what's clear. There's this passage that's referring to kind of this origin story of Lucifer, of Satan. It says, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. So we go all the way back to kind of the creation narrative, till unrighteousness was found in you. And I would try to maybe just suggest that when was unrighteousness found? Probably at the moment he sneaks into Eden, right? And says, I'm going to deceive Eve and Adam to rebel against God. And so you find at least an origin story that happens there. I think Revelation 12 is a important passage. I'm not a Revelation scholar. I walk with a little bit of trepidation talking about Revelation 12. And yet the image of this monster, the sea monster, the dragon, the Leviathan, was known as imagery to be an antithesis, an antagonist against God and his people, and even a representation of the nations that were at war against Yahweh. And so you find the dragon with its tail swiping away all these stars. Like, what is actually happening there? I kind of pulled to Jesus, and when he, and I think we're gonna get to this question later, where he says, I saw Satan like falling like star, falling from the heavens. And it's like, what's actually happening here? I would want to theologize it a little bit and say, when Jesus comes and he disarms the dark powers, I get into this in my last chapter, or the second to last chapter of my book, that disarming and that stripping thing is the removal of any legal right and ability for the dark powers to blind the nations of the world. And so the dragon is working in such a way to create chaos and dissension. And so what we're finding here is maybe a second telling of the fall, but now it's about its disarming and its inability to legally or willfully blind the nations. Now, Clint, correct me on all of the areas that I went wrong.
I love it.
Well, I'm not going to say too much here because I'm really along with you on most of what you're saying here. I'll look forward to a little bit down the road here, a conversation about Luke 10 and the sending out of the 72, and a little bit about Colossians 2:15.
Yeah.
But the portrayal of what's happening in the garden, there's something that has happened right at the beginning to spoil the goodness of God's creation with this kind of deceit and temptation that's taking place right at the beginning.
Good stuff. All right, friends, we're here with Joel Muddamalle, author of The Unseen Battle, and the one and only Clint Arnold, one of my colleagues here at Talbot School of Theology, taking your questions on The Unseen Realm and Unseen Battle by Michael Heiser. Okay, this question came in a bunch, and I'd be really curious how both of you would address this one. It says, in regards to your conversation with Joel, how do we reconcile the Psalm 82 passage, Divine Counsel Worldview, with the words of Jesus in John 10:34 through 10:38? Jesus seems to say that those destined to die as men are indeed men. He seems to argue his claim to be the Son of God is not actually a claim of divinity. What is going on if we understand the Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32 worldview backdrop in Jesus' words in John 10? Joel, take it away, my man.
Okay. I would just want to humbly say this is probably one of the best arguments, one of the best places to be a bit critical and to think like what is actually happening here. Mike actually wrote a academic article that kind of he goes through the various views and all of that. I'm gonna kind of summarize a little bit of what I think is happening, and I'm going to start with a couple questions. One, we know that the Gospel of John is a bit distinct from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think we might agree that Craig Keener wrote some of the best work in Christobiography and arguing for Matthew, Mark, and Luke is kind of an ancient biography. John is doing something a little bit different, actually a lot bit different. John is a much more of a theological gospel, and John has such high Christology, like consistently is trying to put the cosmic Christ on display for us. And so the question is, why would John, who wants to consistently make much of the cosmic Christ, then communicate that Jesus is just another human son of God as a human being like everyone already is? So that's kind of like my first just question. And then the second one is the response, like just exegetically in the text, the response of the people in John 10. It's really curious. Why do they want to stone him if he's simply just making a claim that honestly any other follower of Yahweh could make? And then after his description and his kind of defense, they still want to take him out, So a humanizing of that phrase of Bene Elohim of Psalm 82:6 seems to me to feel lacking in congruency with the actual response of what's taking place here. So what is Jesus doing here? I would want to argue that Jesus is actually acknowledging something that was already well understood to the Israelites of the time, that God had already a sense of cosmic divine beings who were referred to as sons of God. These were angelic beings. And really this is almost like, it feels like Jesus is pushing the agenda just a little bit more, because he starts with I and the Father are one. And then he goes, and by the way, you already know that there are some divine beings out there called the sons of God. And then he's saying, not only am I one among the divine beings, there's just not this human reality, but there's a cosmic reality to me, but I'm actually unlike them in that I'm one with the uncreated creator. And after that statement, the people freak out, right? They try to get him, and then Jesus does a great kind of disappearing act. And so I just think that an appeal to a human ruler's view would actually have done the opposite. I feel like it would have de-escalated the situation instead of kind of turning the heat up in a way.
That's great stuff. That's really helpful. Now, I have a question for you, Clint, a separate one, but you want to jump in anything on John 10?
No, I think he did a marvelous job. I would agree with him wholeheartedly on the way that he's construed that, both in terms of John's theology in presenting Jesus in the most exalted terms, and as well as how else would you explain the response of the people? Yeah, I think that's excellent.
Joel, you are 2 for 2, my man. You're doing pretty well, buddy. Good job.
I'm feeling, listen, you guys, I'm feeling so stressed out being with Dr. Arnold right now because like I in my dissertation, I didn't even get a chance to tell you all this. Like I spent a lot of time working through your commentaries and your work, and it was just a real encouragement to me. So I feel like I'm back in my dissertation defense just a little bit, just so you guys know.
Well, you're killing it. I'm going to toot your horn, Clint. It's fun to have you here, but you are one of the experts on
Truly.
Colossians and spiritual warfare, and so that's why I wanted you here. But before we come back to some of the questions, I just noticed a comment on YouTube, and this is specifically for you. It says, Dr. Arnold, do you have any criticism or pushback to Heiser's thesis and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview? Are there any areas you might differ with him on you'd be willing to tell us about?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and it's probably good to sharpen our understandings by pointing these sorts of things out. But I definitely go far down the road with him on the divine counsel and the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God in Genesis 6, being angelic beings. I think where I am not yet fully convinced is that the origin of demonic spirits comes from the Nephilim, the death of the Nephilim, and disembodied souls of the Nephilim becoming demonic spirits. And this is what we find when Jesus enters the world, the references to demons. And then the sharp differentiation that is made with the language of principalities, powers, authorities, thrones, dominions, world rulers that we find in the Apostle Paul's language. The idea of the disembodied spirits, that being the origin of the demonic, in some ways is really a minority view throughout church history. And I realize our goal is to look at the text and be as true as we can to the text, and the majority aren't always right. But here is where, with many others throughout church history, I wonder if the better explanation is potentially seeing a primeval fall that gives rise to all of this. And then the terminology that we have in the New Testament it differentiates these different kinds of spirits, but it's not the kind of differentiation that Heiser is suggesting here. And so that's the concern that I would have over this. What we see in Psalm 82, the divine counsel and God in his sovereignty giving permission for spirits to do things is sound, I believe.
So 2 things. First off, I absolutely love the respect and admiration in which you communicated that for Heiser. That was a wonderful response. And yet you have some differences. So if people here in the comments are like, wait a minute, we want to hear more, just the comparison and contrast, maybe we could have you back to do a deep dive on this at some point. So give us some comments if that would be helpful. But let's go back to some of the questions that we got. Here's one that was posted on YouTube, and it says, Heiser talks about the principalities which rule or ruled over the 72 nations, and how Christ came to finally assert his authority over all nations, not only the people of Israel. This person asked 2 questions. We'll just do one. Are there principalities today, whether fallen or possibly good ones, who rule over nations like the U.S., China, or Mexico, or Nazi Germany? Are there spiritual battles today in the heavenly realms over the circumstances of nations? And the person actually mentioned, for example, what we've seen with the cartels in Mexico. Should we see these kind of supernatural forces and gods at play behind this? Dr. Joel, take this one away, my man.
Oh gosh, I feel like I'm going to need to tag in Clint pretty early on the language of powers, principalities, authorities. Okay, so I would say that I want to be careful not to create a taxonomy and implications that go beyond what is kind of clear with the scriptures, that the biblical text actually gives us. And this is one of those things that just I'm curious about personally in a lot of ways. I think, and this is where I'd love for Clint to kind of talk about in Colossians when it talks about the stripping and the disarming of the dark powers, what that actually means. I kind of have some ideas around that that I've traced out in the book. But it seems very clear that in the Old Testament, based off of this Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that the gods of the nations had uh, uh, a stewardship responsibility that were given to them to care for the nations, not to be their quote unquote God, but to be stewards. Up until the time that Abraham, the God would use Abraham and the Abraham covenant, Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 22, to reinvite the nations back into the family, into the household of God, and these beings go rebellious. Well, they don't just simply disappear between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And when you look at Daniel 8, 9, and 10, particularly in the Septuagint, and if I'm remembering correctly, later Septuagint translation, the Theodotion translation, which opts for archon pretty consistently, if not every time actually, for the prince, the Hebrew sar or sarim. And so this is the language that Paul is using. And so the gods of the nations of the Old Testament, from my vantage point, what I argue for in the unseen battle, are being recast in the New Testament with the technical term of powers, principalities, authorities, thrones, dominions. This is why Paul says in Ephesians that fight isn't against flesh and blood, but against powers and authorities. And yet they're still active, they're still working. So what's actually happening? I'm going long-winded because I myself am trying to navigate through this. I would say that, are the dark powers still around? Absolutely. Are they still connected to actual lands? I think they are connected to lands and to territories. I think that any legal debt, and that's the Colossians 2:15, and I know Clint's going to get into this, but 2:14 through 15, he erased the certificate of debt with its obligations that was against us and opposed to us, and has taken it away by nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and disgraced them publicly.
Amen.
He triumphed over them in him. And so I would say, while they're active and they're around, they have no legal rights, and they are defeated and in the process of being defeated. And I think it would be unwise not to see the presence of a both and versus opting for a demythologized either or that says, oh no, it's just human rulers, it's just sin, in the flesh, and not be like, well, these powers have been around for a really long time, and maybe the most potent deception of theirs is the manipulation of humanity, to leverage the vices of the flesh, selfish ambition, and vain conceit. And so when you have these hot pockets of moments, I'm just thinking about Mexico and the cartel. I mean, I was watching the videos, on my social media. I just don't know how you can't see the presence of dark powers that are manipulating all this. I think of in First Corinthians, right? That if the powers and principalities, if the authorities knew what they were doing, they would have never sent Jesus to the cross. And so I don't know that I answered it the way that people want me to answer it, but I'm just trying to be clear where the Bible allows us to be clear, and then to responsibly speculate in some other areas.
I think that's fair. Is there anything you'd want to throw in or add to that one, Clint, or any?
Yeah, big topic, and I could love to talk for a long time on this, but let me just say a couple of quick things. First of all, I think if we go to a much more higher meta level, I just want to affirm the fact that we're both talking about, all three of us are talking about the reality of the supernatural realm. And one of the things that I've had to contend with in scholarly circles for so long is the whole notion that these really don't exist in the way we're talking about them here. I remember years ago reading a book, well, it's actually a trilogy of books by a guy named Walter Wenck, a professor at Auburn University, that in the preface said, we moderns can't by any stretch of the imagination bring ourselves around to believe in the real existence of these things. And to do so would be to return to a flat world, a flat earth, and a belief in elves, dragons, and the tooth fairy, and something like that. And so that's one of the big things we've been struggling against. So I am so grateful for the work of Heiser, for what you're doing, Joel, in reaffirming, hey, this is part of our biblical worldview, that these powers are real. Now we're in a position of trying to define more specifically, okay, what are they doing? How do they relate not only to individuals, but to geopolitical institutions and maybe even more broadly into cities, into various kinds of territories? And that's a tough question to answer because the Scripture isn't incredibly clear on that. One thing that I'm convinced of is that the language that we find in the Apostle Paul's writings, thrones, rulers, authorities, world rulers, dominions, it's definitely suggestive of a differentiation within the supernatural realm of spirits that have greater authority, greater power over certain places. And then Daniel 10 helps us to see, like you pointed out, the Greek word archon that is in the New Testament for these kinds of powers appears there in the Septuagint. And there, we could almost say they're empire powers, a spirit over Persia, a spirit over Greece, and so on. So I very much am along the road with you in seeing the fingerprints of the demonic on geopolitical entities, and they're attempting to influence those, and maybe even further down, not only over countries, but over cartels, over various kinds of institutions that are manifesting evil ideologies, evil systems to take us away from the redemptive work of Christ and to imprison people into a system that is unhealthy, destructive, violent, and all of these sorts of things.
Can I ask a question, Sean?
Do it, man.
Clint?
Do it.
I feel like I can't, Clint, not ask you this question. Clint, how do you? I'm so curious too. Like the elemental spirits of Colossians, right? Stoicheia. Like, how do you understand that? And do you think that has anything to do with what we're talking about?
Yes, I think the reference you're making here is to Colossians 2:8 and 20, and then Galatians 4:3 and 4:9. That talks about, in Colossians, it attributes the origin of the false teaching at Colossae to the work of Stoicheia, which I would translate to be elemental spirits or demonic spirits. Mm-hmm. So I take the Stoicheia language as a reference to evil spirits and see it as part of a larger reservoir of terminology that was in use at that time for these kinds of spirits. I think the origin of that language, we can trace it into Judaism and find that at the time of Jesus, people would have been familiar with that terminology for spirits, that it was used by Jewish shamans, as exemplified by a Second Temple text called Testament of Solomon that uses it, of spirits associated with the 36 degrees of the heavenly sphere and spirits associated with each of those elements in the heavens.
All right, Joel, I got a question for you. You're going to have to give me your quick answer on this one, okay?
Okay.
This is a comment. It's from Christy. She says, if your theological position is not polytheism, is it henotheism? If not, can you please explain? And for those listening, polytheism is a view that says there's multiple gods that exist. Henotheism would say there's multiple gods, but there's one supreme God over the others. Are you comfortable with the term for your theology and Heiser's that's henotheism, Joel?
I don't know. I don't like any kind of language that suggests that Yahweh is on any par with any other deity, because that's not the representation of Yahweh himself, like throughout the scriptures. He is the uncreated creator. And so I think that while, all my systematic theology friends are going to be annoyed with me, but like, I think theological terms are really helpful. Concepts like monotheism, polytheism, I just find myself struggling to title ideas and thoughts that the biblical text itself doesn't feel the need to give in such a flat way.
Okay.
And so I think that you can have like monotheism and still be absolutely okay with the presence of other spiritual beings that are created beings that are on no scale in association with Yahweh. And so, am I comfortable with it? I probably just out of caution would prefer not to use that language, just to even out of fear of suggesting to people that there's any kind of equality amongst these spiritual beings.
Fair enough. We'll leave it at that. That was a great question.
Back in Asia Minor in the first century, where Paul wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Galatians, and so on, there was a god called Theos Hoopsistos, which is translated God Most High. And so there's a lot of discussion in the classical literature about henotheism. And henotheism means one God. It's from the Greek word henos, that means one. But it needs to be sharply differentiated from monotheism. And monotheism, which we in Orthodox Christianity have affirmed for years, emphasizes the exclusivity. There's one supreme sovereign God. Whereas henotheism, there's one God, but he might be slightly superior to some of the others.
Oh, good. That's really helpful, which backs up your hesitation, Joel, from using that at all. Okay, good. Really good background. Okay, got a few more here I want to get to. This one might be somewhat quick, but this question says, Catherine wrote in and she said, for some reason, I am much more comfortable with the term angels rather than gods. Am I understanding correctly that the terms Elohim, lowercase, angels, and gods are all used interchangeably? Joel.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a pastoral part of me that thinks when people get caught up on the God stuff, the use or the misuse, don't create chaos for yourself. Like honestly, and so there's a pragmatic side of me, and then there's another side of me that just is like, the Bible does give us precise language for these things, and we're called in spiritual maturity to grow in our understanding and to rightly handle the Word of God. And so I think I'm empathetic really to that hesitation of like, gosh, I'm uncomfortable because of the connotations with it. And when I'm teaching, I kind of often joke, particularly in like more lay settings with, if I'm doing a seminar at a church or something, I'll make a joke like, everybody knows the Bible wasn't written in English, right? And everybody laughs about that. But then it's like, wait, what are the implications of that? And so this terminology of angels is a title and function. Malachim of the Hebrew, Malachim, and then in the New Testament, Angelos. And there's almost this taxonomy of spiritual beings that is being represented to us. I, once again, am cautious. I'm going too far down the road of trying to give taxonomification and qualifications to all these different beings. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in Second Temple writing. But Elohim is a word, I think if I remember correctly, Mike would say it's a designation term. It's this idea that it is a term to distinguish disembodied spiritual beings. Now, that doesn't mean that these beings could never take on corporeal form. Of course they do. We find this all throughout the Old Testament with these angelic beings that show up to Abraham and they eat, or the whole wild situation in Sodom and what happens there with Lot. And so Elohim is a designation term of a kind of being that is disembodied. Angels are given a term to a function. They're messengers. They have a vocation and a responsibility. Bene Elohim seems to be be a technical term for a subset of the divine council that have a particular role and responsibility. We know from Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 that there's a subset of these sons of God that have a role and responsibility to steward the nations, but they fail and they go into rebellion. They don't fail, they intentionally go into rebellion, and they become the false gods of the nations of the Old Testament. And so, yeah, I think, and then like demon, shadu of the Hebrew language, that is again a classification kind of term. And in the New Testament, we've got daimonion. But I don't know. Clint, clean up the languages for me.
I remember in the middle of my doctoral program getting much more into the Dead Sea Scrolls and being surprised that the most common language for that realm was Elim and Elohim. And
Yes.
so you find that just all through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are written 2nd century BC, most of them, and reflect the worldview of Judaism in the land of Israel at the time, leading up to Christ, that language was used regularly for these kinds of beings. And I was also thinking it's instructive to look at 1 Corinthians 8, where we see that an idol has no real existence. And there is no God but one. Okay, a strong assertion of monotheism that Paul gives us there in 1 Corinthians 8. But then he goes on, for although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, and then he notes, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. So there is a little bit of a nod here to the use of the language. But like you, I'm probably more tempted to stay with the term angel or spirits.
Good stuff.
Yeah. I think spirit. I think that's such a good term, Clint. Too is also spirit or spiritual beings. I've opted for cosmic as well. To that in terms of like the realm distinctions. Sometimes we have earthly and we have spiritual. The biblical worldview doesn't want to separate these two things. Like I think is much more comfortable for us. And so I prefer the term cosmic when thinking of the totality of these two realms in coexistence with each other.
All right, guys. I don't even know how to frame this question. I'm not sure what to do with this. It came in. 2 different people asked it kind of in different ways. It's related to the Nephilim. And if they're fallen angels and had sexual relations with human beings, what that would mean for the virgin birth. So let me ask it this way. Somebody says, I agree with the general premise, but I have a question about the Nephilim. If they were the offspring of fallen angels and humans, wouldn't that rob Jesus' virgin birth of its uniqueness and wonder, since lots of people would then not have human fathers? Now, there's some other questions here that I sent to you, Joel, but do you want to weigh in? Do you have any thoughts on this one? Where are you going to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one, there's a question that is in the nature of how can spiritual beings have human relations with human women. And to that, I would just point out, and a lot of people point to the Matthew passage when, they say like Jesus says, we're not going to be given over into marriage. But notice what Jesus says and what he doesn't say. He says we won't be given over into marriage, but he doesn't really comment on the ability or the inability of sexual relations in that context. So there's a little bit to me, making a speculation from silence. Then the other thing that you have is in the Old Testament, you have angelic beings who are eating. You have angelic beings who are walking. You have in the Lot scenario, which is kind of interesting to me, that the men in Sodom were able to distinguish male versus female characteristics of these angelic figures enough so that they would desire to sexually assault them. Right. So there's got to be even something to that. And then the angelic beings physically grab Lot and throw him back into the house. Like, nah, get back here, And so there is a physicality to it. And so I would say that if that's the case, then what you have still, the monogeneous, the unique reality of the Immaculate Conception and the virgin birth still stands with Jesus, because what these cosmic beings are doing, these sons of God, is a perversion of the beautiful intimacy between a husband and wife that God has always intended. And this seems to be spiritual warfare, what the enemy loves to do. The enemy loves to pervert the beauty of God's good creation. And there's this thing that's happening. I try to draw it out of my book in the language of see, desire, and take. And so, these beings see the beauty of the women, desire them, and then take them. That to me seems to be physical. There's a forcefulness to it, and there's obviously an Enochic tradition that is a background to this as well. But yeah, that's how I would try to answer that best that I can.
That's great. By the way, there's a history of people, especially great leaders and influential people, having some kind of supernatural pregnancy that they came from in some fashion. And J. Gresham Machen responds to this, I think around 1920s, on the virgin birth of Christ, and talks about how some of these even Greco-Roman deities had these kind of unique births. But these are like the gods stepping in, acting far more like the Nephilim in Genesis 6, where there's this sexual boundary breaking violation of human beings. None of that is present in the virgin birth at all. It's clearly not sexual. This is God, the one who made us. He's honoring to Mary. That contrast is still there between Genesis 6 and all these other seeming supernatural births. And of course, one is a violation. The other one is fulfilling prophecy, which is just totally, totally different. And there is a difference between having some kind of apparent non-natural birth and having God be your father, like Jesus clearly says. Right. Yeah. So I think that still stands, even if there is some similarity between the Nephilim and between the virgin birth in terms of a non-natural kind of relations that take place as far as it goes.
And the emphasis in Luke's gospel is the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary, and the emphasis on this is a divine birth, not just a random spiritual birth of some sort.
That's a good distinction. Again, the overshadowing, there's just nothing sexual or violating going on whatsoever that we see in every other account. All right, we got a few more, and then we'll take some live ones here. I see people commenting in. Janice wrote in. Again, we're here with Joel Muddamalle talking about his book, The Unseen Battle and Questions on the Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser, joined by my colleague and my friend and expert on spiritual warfare, Clint Arnold. Janice wrote in and said, "Is it unclear? It's unclear to me if the Son of God are only evil beings or are some good. When the nations were divided according to the number of the sons of God in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. And she describes how we briefly touched on this, but do we know enough to answer that, Joel, whether all of these gods of these nations completely rebelled or if some are good? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think we can only see what the text says, which seems to present that the sons of God of Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, based off of, Deuteronomy 4:19 and elsewhere, they go into full-blown rebellion. And then you look at Psalm 82 particularly. I don't know that we have even had an opportunity to spend much time in Psalm 82, but the indictment against these Bene Elohim, the sons of God, is an indictment against their lack of righteousness and uprightness. Like it really, like if you read through the minor prophets, it feels like, oh gosh, like everything Amos, Micah, Nahum, all the things that is an indictment against the nations and the way in which Israel is tempted into follow after the nations surrounding them are all indictments of the oppression of the poor, of the careless attitude towards the least of these, the corruption of power. And Psalm 82 puts an indictment against the sons of God for that. And so I think when we read all those together, I think that you can say, yeah, the sons of God that are presented there, the gods of the nations, have gone into full rebellion. And then there's enough evidence in Isaiah chapter 6, the presence of, in Daniel 8, 9, and 10, Michael, and these other angelic beings that are still absolutely faithful to the Lord and doing his work, and our messenger sent to bring his divine aid and help. One of the things I love about the book of Daniel is, I think it's in Daniel 8, if I'm correct. I'm blanking on that, but he prays. Maybe it's Daniel 9. He prays, and the angelic help comes to him. And when angelic help comes to him, the text says explicitly, from the moment you humbled yourself and you prayed, your prayers, your words were heard. And now I had to deal with the Prince of Persia for a bit of time, and then I had to have some aid along the way. But I would say, yeah, we have enough evidence to see that not all of the angelic beings went into rebellion, but there was a subset of them, and they have made their bed. It's fun. Clint brought up Walter Wink, and I read a bunch of Wink stuff for my dissertation, and was super helpful in a lot of ways. But there's one thing that Wink suggested, which was the rehabilitation or the restoration, the possible restoration of the powers. And I just flatly think that you just don't find that. There's just nowhere that suggests that fallen angelic beings can be rehabilitated or restored. And I actually think Psalm 82 is kind of the linchpin for that. So.
Good stuff. Are you good with that, or anything you want to throw in here?
No, I'm good with that. I mean,
Okay.
As you were talking, Joel, it just struck me. I mean, just what a horrible situation that leaves the world in. But when we look around at the world and see all of the various ways that evil is fomented, we know something is deeply, deeply awry in this world. And it points us to the fact that there's only one hope, and one hope is in the gospel.
Amen.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true.
So so conceivably it's possible that we know some of these gods or angels stayed positive in following the Lord, but the evidence that they're over realms, as we see the sons of God divided into, there's no positive evidence for that. So we should hold back and not claim that without biblical evidence.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about this for a minute. This came in, and this person says, I would push back on his statement. I think this is your statement, Joel, regarding not doing deliverance ministry. And you can clarify if you said that or not, but when Jesus sends out the 12 and then the 70 to 72, he gives them authority to heal and cast out evil spirits. It's part and parcel to the demonstration of the kingdom. So it's always been both and. So I think he's saying your model of how we rethink spiritual warfare is important, but it doesn't replace deliverance ministry. They should go together. Agree, disagree, clarify your comments, and respond if you can.
Yeah, I need to go back and listen to that. I apologize ahead of time if I was careless with my words. I don't at all mean that there is no room or that we should not do deliverance ministry. If I can remember correctly from that conversation, I was talking about my viewpoint of trying to focus on normative versus non-normative actions. And at times I believe that we live in a culture that likes to, and this is that Lewis quote that I opened my book with, which is the magician versus the materialist. And sometimes in that pursuit of the obsessive of the supernatural, we're looking for demons around every corner, and we feel like we've got this imperative that's been given to us in order to cast out demons. And again, I will gladly step aside to allow Dr. Arnold to Clint to respond to this, because actually I think his book, Three Crucial Questions on Spiritual Warfare, is where I'm actually drawing a lot of where I've come to. But like, our primary weapon is the gospel. The primary weapon of spiritual warfare is the good news of Jesus. Now, what I'm not saying in clarification is that there's no room for deliverance ministry, or there's never a need for exorcism. I'm just trying to create a distinction between what is normative versus what is non-normative. And even for this passage, that the individual is talking about in Luke 10, like, take a look at what the text actually says. And there's something kind of fascinating about this. There's a little bit of a textual discrepancy of if it's 70 or 72. I'm pulling some of the stuff from the top of my brain, so excuse any errors that I'm about to make. If I can remember correctly, I think the textual difference is in the Septuagint translation. One says 70, the other says 72, versus the Masoretic text. Regardless of how you do it, it actually draws back to the Tower of Babel parable and the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10, there's a correlation that's taking place, whichever number you land to, because it's consistent in the translation kind of options that you have. So let's go with 72 because that's what it's opts for in the Greek text, I believe. And so 72 would mirror the Deuteronomy 32 worldview with the table of nations, the number of angelic beings that are presented to guard over the nations. And so here you have the exact number of that same group of people that are now being sent out. But I want to just read the text. And once again, let's look at what Jesus says and what he doesn't say. So Jesus in Luke 10, 1-3, after this, I'm reading from ESV. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him 2 by 2 into every town and place where he himself was about to go. And he said to them, so this is what he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into this harvest. Go your way. Behold, I'm sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. If I were these 72, I'd have a couple of questions about that last statement that Jesus made about the whole lambs and the wolves situation. But that's a side note. I'm making a joke. Notice what Jesus is saying. He's saying, go spread the gospel. And there's a passage later in Luke where Jesus says, if by the hand of God I cast out demons and the kingdom of God has come upon you. Jesus' first kind of demon exorcism is Luke chapter 4. And so what's happening here is that demon exorcism is a visible, tangible witness of the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. And what he tasks the 72 to do is to go out and to preach the gospel, preach his news, his good news, the harvest is plentiful. And then they come back in verse 17 and they go like, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And there's all kinds of interpretive questions about that I think is, again, related to that Revelation 12 passage. But I think that what is normative is gospel proclamation. And guess what? When the gospel goes to dark places, demons are exposed. Spiritual beings are seen for their deception, and you'll have to deal with it. But the order to me matters. The order is the gospel, Colossians 1:13, a transfer from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of light. And then as the Lord equips you and calls you and gives you wisdom and discernment and prayer and fasting, there may be need for deliverance ministry. And there's a whole bunch more that we could go there, but hopefully that summarizes it.
I love it. Yeah, you mentioned the book by Clint. It's called 3 Crucial Questions About Spiritual Warfare that was critical to a lot of your own research. Clint,
Yes.
you and I did a whole separate episode. I guess we could link to it here on spiritual warfare, biblically speaking. But anything you want to jump in here in terms of how we think about spiritual warfare in terms of like the divine counsel and kind of the gods that potentially influence from the top down?
Yeah. Hey, great job, Joel, with Luke 10. I think you're exactly right. The 72, there's something symbolic going on here with those 72 and the correlation with the table of the nations in Genesis 10 and what's going to happen in the mission of the church. And I think the order is right. The Apostle Paul said, the gospel is the power of God to salvation for all who believe. Gospel is first and primary. That's the mission of the church. That's what we learn about through the book of Acts. There's exorcism, deliverances taking place through the book of Acts, but the main thing is the main thing, and that's the gospel, penetrating the Gentile world, seeing people come to Christ, and seeing communities of believers formed. One thing that I would throw in here, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I threw out a view at the last Evangelical Theological Society meeting and got some good response to it, where I've kind of parted ways with some of the traditional interpretations of this text that are looking for some explanation of that text of Satan being dethroned, whether it was in the primeval past or, what have you, throughout the history there. I think what Jesus is saying is he's seeing the 72 go out and engage in their mission. They're able to overcome the power of the enemy in the lives of people, and they're excited about that. And he's saying, when you guys were doing this, I saw Satan fall like lightning, not in the sense of I saw Satan dethroned, but in the sense I saw Satan raging in opposition to the mission of the church. And I think the like lightning has always puzzled me. It's like there's more to it than just suddenness. The like lightning imagery, whether it's ancient Near East or in the Greek-speaking world, conveys the idea of opposition. Baal held thunderbolts in his arms and raged against his enemies with lightning. The Greek-speaking world, Zeus as well, when he fought the Titans, he had the thunderbolt in his hand, and you can find statues of him holding a thunderbolt like lightning. And what I think this is saying is this whole thing is prefiguring the mission of the church and the sending out of disciples to take the gospel to the world. But I think Jesus is saying, you will experience opposition, powerful supernatural opposition when you go out. But I have given you authority. And so I think that's part of the message of what's going on here. And then we see this played out in the book of Acts.
Good stuff.
So
I love
good.
this. Hey, tell us
That's
really
really
quickly, you're teaching a class in the fall on spiritual warfare. This is a master's level class. Just give us a quick synopsis, because we have a lot of people listening that think about coming here and studying with us at Talbot School of
This
Theology.
is something that we got started in the early 90s. And I teamed up back then with a psychologist who was the director of our Biola University Counseling Center, and then a missionary anthropologist who had spent his entire career in Irian Jaya among an animistic people.
Interesting.
And we had started meeting for lunch every week to try to figure out particular cases of situations where people felt themselves being troubled by the demonic. And is it psychological? Is it spiritual? And how do we discern? And so we took it on the road in the sense of we decided to invite students from the School of Psychology, the School of Missions, from Talbot, and we had this class and just grappled with these various issues on, like, how do you discern if something is demonic or if it's psychological or if it's a combination of both? And then what do you do? What do you do about it in real practical terms? And that gave birth to this class. Both of my colleagues are now retired, so I've gone solo on it. But we have a good time trying to figure this out together.
That's amazing. Well, what we're doing right now is called Talbot Tuesdays. And right now we're doing them every other Tuesday for an hour. And we are streaming with a Talbot professor, doing our best to bring these resources to you. But of course, would love to have you think about studying with us. And that's a class I am tempted to want to take myself.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in with you because I need that one.
We need to get you out here sometime to teach a full class on Heiser for a weekend. Let's talk about that, Joel. Now that it goes through my mind, I think we get a lot of interest in that. Now, in fact, comment if you want us to do a whole class on this and have Joel come out here, and maybe we could have Clint, you guys could tag team, but I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, you made a comment to me right before we started, Joel, that you wanted to clarify certain comments that you made on Genesis chapter 6. Jump in and clarify.
Yeah, I want to be precise in my language, and I make mistakes or I'm unclear at times. And so I want to allow this to be an opportunity to clear up one of the things I talked about with the book of Enoch. And I think what I was talking about is the book of Enoch is a helpful background cultural context to Genesis chapter 6. And there was actually a comment by a PhD of ancient history who was like, wait a minute, that's not tracking with me because Book of Enoch is like circa, it's like 2nd century, maybe 3rd century. And then it's actually and this is just me talking about Enoch now. He didn't say all of this, but he was basically like, how can a book written later on provide any kind of background cultural information to a book in Genesis 6, right? So, and I was like, oh gosh, yeah, that's a really great comment that deserves clarification. And so the book of Enoch is split into 3 books. The first book is the book of the Watchers, probably the more reliable, definitely the more reliable of the latter 2. And this the commenter was absolutely correct that it was written much later. There's a third, if this was like a stool, I would just argue there's a third leg that is present, that is what's actually doing the connection here, where Genesis 6 is drawing on Mesopotamian mythic stories that were embedded into the culture, into the fabric of the people. Particularly the story about the Apkallu, these 7 sages who transmit wisdom to human 7 kings, and this is pre-flood, and then after the flood, it's kind of interesting. They show back up, but now they're not fully divine because the 7 divine Apkallu, they go into the abyss, and now we have I think it's like 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. In fact, Gilgamesh is distinguished this way. And so there was a common mythic story that was already present in the time of Genesis 6, which is one of the rationale and reasons for why you only have 4 verses for the story of the sons of God and the daughters of man and the Nephilim, is because there was some contextual information that was already embedded in the time for the people, that the biblical author doesn't feel the need to explain this entire story. It's the same way, I think I did it in the podcast interview, if I asked, and actually I'm going to ask Clint, who's the GOAT, MJ or LeBron?
MJ for sure.
Let's
oh
go.
My gosh, MJ.
Now we can
awesome.
absolutely teach a class together. That was actually my only concern. Yes, and we know MJ, Michael Jordan, contextually against LeBron, GOAT means greatest of all time. If I said who's the GOAT, MJ or Prince, you might say, oh, we're talking about music, so maybe we're talking about Michael Jackson and not Michael Jordan. Context, we do this all the time. We don't feel the need to explain everything. So the book of Enoch is actually doing a couple things in my view. One is it is retrieving for us a story that was already present in the time of Genesis 6 and also in the time of Second Temple literature. Secondarily, it's preserving that story for us because this was most likely an oral tradition that was already present, though it was written in tablets in different places that we can find close to the dating of Genesis 6. And then third, it is transmitting that information to us today so we can retrieve it. So the validity of Enoch as background cultural information is less about this book being something that is chronologically superior or chronologically dated. It actually is more about interpretive witness. It is bearing witness to a tradition that was present, that both Genesis 6 and the Enochic tradition. And if you compared all the stories together, you would notice that the Enochic tradition is intentionally reversing the Apkallu story in such a way that is actually polemically arguing against that mythic story. And so I just want to bring clarity to that because I thought that was a really good comment and valid pushback on a statement that needs more context.
Well, here's a comment that says, Mutamale is the GOAT. Someone needs to let MJ know.
That's great.
So awesome stuff. Well, we probably got to somewhat get close and wrap up here. Here's one question I want to comment on really quickly. Katie says, do you think AI is the mark of the beast? Now, let me pause and say, one of the things that I've been doing on this channel is on Sundays, I've been bringing on Talbot professors. In fact, Clint, we've released one with you. We have 3 or 4 more coming up with you, taking some of the toughest passages in the New Testament and giving 6, 8, 10-minute thoughtful responses to them. So just had one with Eric Tonnes on the words that, is it possible to do miracles in Jesus' name and then never know him and be sent away? How is that possible? And so I did a 5-part series on the rapture, did one on the mark of the beast with Alan Holtberg, who's just a bona fide expert on Revelation. We release those on Sundays. Those are short videos. So if you haven't seen those, that's something that you'll want to track. Probably got to let you go here. Joel, did I miss anything? Any other questions you wanted to respond to? Anything else you want to throw in about the Divine Council or Heiser or your excellent book, The Unseen Battle, before we call it a night?
No, Sean, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to respond to some of these things, to clarify some things that I might have been unclear on, and incredibly honored, Clint, for your engagement with this, and very grateful for your scholarship. And if people haven't already, Clint's commentary on Colossians is so good, and also the 3 crucial questions about spiritual warfare. So just really honored for the opportunity to be with you guys.
I will second that. I read your commentary. I told you that. It is huge. I read probably 90% of it. And we've had you on a couple times. I'll have you back. Folks, if you're thinking, I want more of this guy, Clint Arnold, if he's new to you, we've done 2 shows in the past on an archaeological discovery taking place right now at Colossae on spiritual warfare. But let us know. Say, here's an angle on spiritual warfare that would be really helpful that maybe we could explore. It would be great. Or if you want us to cover more on Michael Heiser, what would be a helpful angle to have a theology professor or a couple theology professors weigh in on a certain book that he did? Or maybe Clint gave a little bit of where he differs with Heiser. If you want me to bring him back and do a deep dive on that, comment and let us know. Also, mark your calendars, because the next time we're doing Talbot Tuesday, I made a note here, is on March 10th, Tuesday. The Friday before, which is March 6th, I'm releasing a 2-hour deep dive, a debate on hell. We've got Chris Date, we had him in studio, and we also had Paul Copan in studio. Eternal conscious punishment / torment versus the annihilationism conditional immortality view. And what's cool about that is we had about 15 or 20 Talbot and Biola students here asking questions, kind of engaged in the conversation. And then I have 2 theology professors coming on after that for our next Talbot Tuesday. It'll be Eric Tonnes and Alan Holtberg to give their comments and, like here, respond to questions. So make sure you mark your calendars. That'll be Tuesday, March 10th at 4:30. We'll do that Pacific Standard Time live. All right, friends, this has been a blast. Joel, really appreciate you. Have a wonderful trip. I hope folks will pick up your book, The Unseen Battle. It's really good. And if people actually manage to make their way all the way through this Q&A and didn't hear our original conversation, they need to go back for some serious context. And minimally, a lot of people said that was some of the most helpful 75 minutes just understanding the theology of Michael Heiser that they've heard. So you nailed it, my friend. We will have you back. Appreciate you. You are the GOAT. Thanks for being here. And Dr. Clint Arnold, really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, it's great, Sean, to be with you once again. And Joel, thank you for your good work and your just princely attitude and disposition. It's just a joy to be with you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Blessings. We'll see